Elias Arden was 7 years old the first time he understood that the world was not fair. He was standing in the great hall of his father's house, a wide, old building with tall wooden ceilings and stone floors that stayed cold even in summer. His father, a broad-shouldered man with silver in his beard and fire in his eyes, was addressing a room full of people, advisors, elders, men in dark suits who smelled of ink and old money. And standing just behind his father's left shoulder, as he always did, was Elias's older brother, Dorian. Dorian was 12 then. He was taller than Elias, sharper in the face, and very good at smiling in a way that looked warm, but never quite reached his eyes. He caught Elias staring at him from across the room and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "You are beneath me, little brother, but I will be kind about it." Elias did not understand everything that day, but he understood enough. He understood that Dorian already saw himself as the one in charge, and he understood that everyone in the room seemed to agree. Still, Elias was not the kind of boy who gave up easily. He was quiet, yes. He was gentle, yes. But underneath that gentleness, there was something solid, something that did not bend. His mother had called it his quiet fire. She said it was the best thing in him. She said it would carry him further than any loud ambition ever could. She was right. She just could not have known how far the fire would need to carry him before the journey was done. The years passed. Elias grew. He studied hard, worked harder, and earned the respect of the people around him through simple, honest effort. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. He trusted the wrong people sometimes, and was too slow to see when a smile was a weapon. But his heart was good, and most people who spent real time with him could feel that. His father could feel it too. And as the old man aged, he leaned more and more on Elias. Not on Dorian, on Elias. This was the thing that started the slow, quiet fire between the two brothers. Not a big argument. Not a single dramatic moment. Just the growing realization, in Dorian's chest, that the wrong brother was winning, at least in their father's eyes. Dorian did not show his feelings about this openly. He was far too smart for that. Instead, he smiled more. He worked the room better. He befriended every advisor, every elder, every person who stood between the present and the future. He built a network of loyalty, brick by brick, in silence, while Elias focused on the work itself and assumed that good work would be enough. That was Elias's great mistake. He believed that doing the right thing, in the right way, for the right reasons, would protect him. He believed that truth was a shield. It is not. Truth is a sword, and you have to be willing to use it. It happened on a Tuesday. Elias remembered that detail clearly. Later, because he had always thought that the big moments in life would arrive on important feeling days, but they rarely do. They arrive on ordinary Tuesdays when you are thinking about something else entirely. He was called into a meeting with the senior advisors, men he had known since childhood, men who had eaten at his family's table, men who had shaken his hand and told him he was going to be great. They were all seated when he entered. Dorian was there too, at the far end of the table, very still. The lead advisor, a thin man named Gerald who always carried a leather folder, placed a set of documents on the table and pushed them slowly toward Elias. "These are the findings," Gerald said. "The council has reviewed the situation. There are concerns about your judgment, about some decisions you made last year. There is a feeling among the group that perhaps, at this time, a different form of leadership would be more appropriate." Elias looked at the documents. He read them carefully. Every word on those pages was either a half-truth or a complete lie, dressed up in formal language and signed by people he had trusted. He looked up at Gerald. Then he looked at Dorian. Dorian was looking at his own hands. He did not meet Elias's eyes. That was the moment Elias knew everything. Not just that he was being removed. Not just that the documents were false. He knew that his brother, his own blood, had built this, had planned it, had used every friendship Elias had extended as a doorway into those friendships, and had quietly turned them all against him. Elias did not shout. He did not throw the papers across the table. He did not do any of the things that a part of him desperately wanted to do. He simply sat back in his chair, breathed slowly, and said, "I understand." Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room. He did not look back. Not once. What followed was the hardest period of Elias's life. He lost his position. He lost access to the resources he had built. Many of the people who had called themselves his friends stopped returning his calls. The story that Dorian and the advisors had written about him spread quickly, and in the version of the story they told, Elias was the problem. He was unstable. He was difficult. He had made serious errors that could not be ignored. None of it was true. But the people who might have defended him either did not know the truth well enough to argue, or were too afraid to try. Elias moved into a small apartment on the east side of the city. He took whatever work he could find. There were months when he ate poorly and slept on a mattress on the floor, and stared at the ceiling in the dark, replaying every conversation, every decision, every moment he had missed, looking for the point where he could have changed things. He found it eventually. The point was not a single decision. The point was a pattern. He had been so focused on being good that he had forgotten to be careful. He had handed trust to people who had not earned it, simply because he wanted the world to work that way. He had believed that if he acted with honor, others would too. They would not. And now he knew that. There were nights when he thought about giving up entirely, not in a dangerous way, but in a quiet, exhausted way. Nights when the idea of simply disappearing, of going somewhere no one knew him, and starting a completely different life, under a completely different name, felt like the only sensible path. What stopped him was a letter. It came from an old friend, a man named Samuel, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Elias, who had known him before the house, before the position, before any of it. Samuel had heard what happened through the grapevine, and tracked down Elias's new address, and sent a handwritten note on plain paper. The note said only 3 things. First, I know this is not true. Second, I am still here. Third, when you are ready, so am I. Elias read that note 7 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of his jacket. And the next morning, he got up earlier than usual and went for a long walk and made a decision. He was not done. The change did not happen overnight. It never does. Real transformation is slow and uncomfortable, and invisible to everyone watching from the outside. While Dorian sat at the head of the table that should have been Elias's, Elias was doing something far more important. He was becoming someone Dorian could not have predicted, and could not have prepared for. He began to study, not just his own field, but everything, the way power actually worked, the way decisions got made behind closed doors, the way false stories could be built, and more importantly, the way they could be taken apart. He read everything he could find. He spoke to people in quiet corners of the city, people who understood systems and structures from the inside. He reconnected with Samuel, and through Samuel, with a small group of people who had their own reasons for wanting the truth to come out. A woman named Priya, who had worked as a record keeper for years, and had seen things she was never supposed to see. A young man named Theo, who was quiet and methodical, and frightening in his attention to detail. A retired advisor named Mr. Okoro, who had resigned before Elias's removal, and who knew every corner of the system, the way a surgeon knows the inside of the body. Together, slowly, carefully, they began to build something. They were not building a case for revenge. Elias made that clear from the beginning. He was not interested in hurting Dorian for the sake of hurting him. He was not interested in public anger or dramatic confrontations or making his brother look small. He was interested in one thing only, the truth. Documented, verified, undeniable truth, presented to the right people, in the right way, at the right time. Anger makes you fast, Elias told the group one evening, but patience makes you right. 18 months passed, then 24, then 30. During those months, things continued as they had. Dorian held his position. The advisors who had signed the false documents went about their lives. Gerald carried his leather folder to meetings and spoke in careful sentences, and acted as though nothing had ever happened. But beneath all of that, things were shifting, quietly, without announcement. Priya had located the original documents, the real ones, the ones that showed what Elias had actually done, and decided, with no editing, no removal of context, no convenient gaps. Theo had traced the timeline of the false story and found the exact moments where Dorian's fingerprints appeared. Small decisions, quiet redirections, recommendations made to the right people that had nothing to do with good judgment and everything to do with a plan. Mr. Okoro, who still had deep connections in the world they all moved in, quietly began having conversations. Not accusations, just conversations, offering certain people the opportunity to reconsider their positions before things became official. Several of them took the opportunity. More than Elias had expected, honestly, because many of the people who had signed their names to the false narrative had done so out of fear, not conviction. And when they realized that the man they had helped to remove was not gone, that he had in fact been watching and working and building for 3 years, the fear shifted direction. It stopped pointing at Dorian. It started pointing at what was coming. Elias walked back into his father's building on a Wednesday morning in early spring. He was 34 years old. He wore a simple dark suit and carried a single briefcase. He was alone. He did not announce his arrival. He did not need to. The people who needed to know he was coming already knew, and the people who did not know were about to find out. He was shown into the main conference room by a young assistant who recognized him from years ago and could not hide the surprise on her face. Elias smiled at her, a real smile, not a performance, and thanked her quietly. The room was full when he entered. Advisors, elders, several members of the board who had been brought in after his removal. Gerald was there, in the same seat he always took, with the same leather folder. And at the head of the table, Dorian. Dorian's face, when he saw Elias, went through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, then something close to fear. Then, very deliberately, calm. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. Elias, he said, as though this were a pleasant and expected event. This is unexpected. Not entirely, Elias said. He took a seat. Not at the far end, at the center. I sent notice through Mr. Okoro's office 3 days ago. I believe everyone here received it. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Several others did not meet his eyes. Elias placed the briefcase on the table. He opened it. He took out 3 sets of documents, neat, organized, labeled, and slid them to the people sitting closest to him, to be passed around. These are the original records, he said, the real ones. I am not here to argue, or to accuse anyone in this room of anything today. I am here to present what is true, what was always true, and what I believe most of the people in this room have always known. Not. What followed was not a dramatic scene from a film. There was no shouting. No one flipped a table. No one stormed out. It was quiet, methodical, and in many ways more powerful for being so. Document by document, the false story came apart. The timeline that Theo had built showed clearly how the narrative had been constructed. The original records that Priya had recovered showed just as clearly what the real facts were. And the statements, voluntarily given by several of the advisors who had reconsidered their positions, filled in the remaining gaps. Dorian sat at the head of the table and said very little. There was not much to say. Every time he opened his mouth to push back, another document appeared that made the pushback impossible. He was not being attacked. He was simply being surrounded by the truth, which is a far more effective thing. Gerald, halfway through the meeting, quietly closed his leather folder and did not open it again. By the time Elias had finished presenting, the room was very still. Not the still of shock, the still of recognition. Of people who had known something was wrong for a long time and were now watching the thing they had been avoiding look them in the face. One of the elder board members, a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had been in the organization for decades, spoke first. "What do you want, Elias?" she asked, not hostile, genuine. "What was always mine," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." It took 6 more weeks for the formal process to be completed. There were reviews and meetings and procedures that had to be followed. The world runs on process, even when the right answer is obvious. But the outcome was never really in doubt after that Wednesday morning. Elias was restored to his rightful position. Dorian resigned quietly and left the city. Gerald retired early. Several of the advisors left as well, some by choice, some by necessity. The organization that had pushed Elias out did not collapse. It found its footing again, gradually, with new people in key roles and an old name returned to the right chair. The people who had stayed loyal to Elias through the difficult years were recognized and given the positions they deserved. Samuel was given a senior role that no one questioned because he had earned it 100 times over, in quiet, steady ways. Priya and Theo were brought on officially. Mr. Okoro returned as a senior advisor, and this time, Elias knew, the advice would be honest. What Elias could not explain easily to people who had not lived through it was this: he was not the same person who had walked out of that first meeting 3 years earlier. That man had been good but naive, trusting but unguarded. He had led with his heart and left his eyes half closed. He had believed that fairness was the natural state of things, and had been completely unprepared for the discovery that it was not. The man who sat now at the head of the table was still good. He still believed in honesty and fairness, and treating people with respect. He had not let the hard years make him cold or bitter or small. He had refused, very deliberately, to become the kind of person who had been done to him. But he was also wiser now. He understood that trust had to be built slowly and tested carefully. He understood that a room full of nodding heads did not always mean a room full of honest hearts. He understood that leadership was not simply about doing the right thing in front of the right audience. It was about building systems and relationships strong enough that the truth could survive, even when powerful people wanted it buried. He led differently, because of everything he had lost and found and rebuilt. He asked more questions. He listened to people who worked in the quieter corners of the organization, the ones who rarely got invited to the big meetings, but who always seemed to know what was really happening. He moved more carefully. He was more patient. He was more present. And the people around him could feel it. The ones who worked closest to him said the same thing, in different ways. This was a man who had been tested, completely, and had not broken. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. One evening, several months after everything had settled, Elias stayed late in the office alone. Everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet. The lights in the city outside the tall windows were just beginning to come on. He sat at his desk and did nothing for a while. He did not check his messages. He did not review any documents. He just sat there in the growing dark and breathed. He thought about his mother, who had called it his quiet fire. He thought about Samuel's 3-line letter on plain paper. He thought about the cold apartment and the mattress on the floor, and the long nights staring at the ceiling. He thought about all of it without flinching, because he had learned that the hardest parts of a person's story are also the most important parts. You do not get to carry the good without also carrying the difficult. They come together, always. He thought about Dorian too, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that what he felt was not anger. It was something more complicated. Sadness, perhaps. Or maybe just an honest recognition that people are capable of both very good and very poor choices, and that the distance between those two things is narrower than anyone likes to admit. He did not forgive Dorian in a grand, declared way, but he did not carry hatred either. Hatred was too heavy, and he was done carrying things that slowed him down. After a while, Elias stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked out the window at the city for a long moment, the same city where he had once eaten poorly and slept on a floor, and wondered if any of it would ever turn around. Then he picked up his bag, turned off the light, and walked home. Not as the boy who had been forgotten, not as the man who had been wronged, as himself, exactly as himself. And that, in the end, was everything.